Alright, welcome back to another Python programming tutorial. And today we are going to be talking about the idea of typecasting. Now, this is going to bridge on to the idea that there are different types of data that exist inside of a program. So let's go ahead and just review the types of data that we've discussed so far. So in most programming languages, you have different types of data, and depending on the type of data that you are using, the operations or how that data reacts to different inputs and outputs changes. So the first type of data that's most common is called a string. A string is a sequence of characters encapsulated by quotation marks. So an example of a string would be this, for example, or this. Anything encapsulated by quotation marks is a string, and that's pretty much what a string is. The next one, and the most commonly used, is going to be an int or an integer. An int are whole numbers and their opposites. Now, you can not have a decimal point when dealing with an int. So although technically this is a whole number, this would not be considered an integer, and I just wanted to make a note of that. However, I still teach integers as whole numbers and their opposites because I think it's just easier for a younger audience to grasp that. So anyways, this would be an int right here. This is also an example, this is also an example of an int. It can also be much larger in both directions. I guess negative would be smaller, but I digress. Anyways, moving right along here, we next have a float. That is going to be numbers that include a decimal. So for example, 10.0 would be a float. This would be a float. 7.809, that would be a float. And technically this would also be a float, although if you printed this value, it would automatically include a decimal point. But there you go. That's a float. It's essentially your non-whole numbers, and it can go quite a few decimal places out. I would have to look at the exact amount, but it can go quite a few out. And it's generally used, again, for numbers that, need more precision than a whole number. So there's your float. And the next one's going to be a Boolean. Booleans are anything that can take two values. So 0, 1, yes, no, but in most cases it's true or false. So it's either true, yes, this thing is true, or no, this thing is false. And that's a Boolean. And it's named after the famous French physicist that I believe lived in the 19th century, but I'd have to double check that. But a Boolean can only take two values, and in most cases that is true or false. And then the last one is going to be non-existence in Python. Non-existence in Python is represented by the keyword none, meaning it is straight up non-existent in your program. I won't go too much into the difference between having zero of something and having an entity be non-existent. I did that in a different video. Please go ahead and check that out. But the keyword none in Python means non-existence. All right, now that we've gone and reviewed our data types here, I'm going to go ahead and comment all of this out for reference here. Let's go ahead and look at the idea of typecasting. Typecasting is when you take one data and you change it into a different type of data. So most commonly, you would be changing, for example, like a string into an integer. So let's go ahead and look here. Let's say I have a number, and let's say that number is the string 7. I'm going to go ahead and print now number plus 7, and this is going to give me an error. The reason why this is going to give me an error is because 7 is an integer here, but number stores the data of a string. And you can't add strings and integers because they are different. They don't have the same name. So I go ahead and run this, and as you can see, it's going to crash here in a second. Yes. And right here it says, failed to do this, type error, not concatenate string to an integer. Right. So you may be thinking, oh, great, well, let me just make this into a string. And you'd be sad to find out that this doesn't work. Let's go ahead and look at what happens. You get this, 77. But that's not 7 plus 7, that's two 7s put together, right? That's because the plus sign changes based upon the data that it's working with. In this case, it's working with a string, which is represented by the variable number, and then another string here. When you add two strings together, it concatenates, meaning it puts them together like this. It does not add them together. You can only add numbers together. This is the whole reason why typecasting exists. So, if I want to add these two things together, I will have to typecast this to an integer. And this right here is an example of typecasting. This is when you take one data that was originally a string and you change it into another type of data. Let's go ahead and run our program now, and you will see 14 will pop up here on the console window. And that is our result. So right here is an example of a typecast. Now you can take, for example, numbers and change them to strings. So for example, I can go number is, now if I just put number here, this won't work because number is a integer here. So this won't work because it's going to try and concatenate a number with an integer. So I can actually typecast this to a string by doing str, just like so. Boom. And when I run this, it will now work. So that's typecasting to a string is str. And we'll go ahead and now look at the various typecasts. So I'll go ahead and just do a print statement here, and we'll just do, for a float is float. Pretty straightforward. Converts anything into a float, could be a string, right? Let's say this was a Boolean. To do Boolean, you're just going to type in bool, B-O-O-L, and as you see it pops up right here, and I believe this has to be lowercase, excuse me, and then here I'll put in the variable number, and now I'll typecast it to a bool. If you want this to take the value of none, then you wouldn't actually typecast that, you would just set this equal to none, like so. Oops. And it will now take the value of none. So the main, now granted there are many different data types, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but that is the general basis of typecasting. It's taking a data that is of one type and changing it into a different type based on your program's requirements for the data. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will see you all in the next one.